Okay, our topic for today are called the properties of operations. And so these have to do with addition and multiplication. None of these properties include subtraction or division, so that's an important thing to remember. There are 5 properties that we're going to talk about, and then you're going to do an assignment to figure out if you can tell the difference between the different properties. So the first property is called the commutative property. C-O-M-M-U-T-A-T-I-V-E. Commutative. The commutative property. And I want you to underline the first 2 letters in the word commutative. C-O. That can help you remember what this property talks about. So in the commutative property, numbers can change. That starts with a C, right? Order, that starts with an O. So I want you to underline C and O. So commutative starts with C and O, and then change order starts with C and O. Okay, so in the commutative property, this can work for addition and it can work for multiplication. 2 plus 3. I could say 3 plus 2, and that's the same thing because 2 plus 3 equals 5, but so does 3 plus 2. So the commutative property just says that if I switch around the order of numbers, as long as I'm adding, then I'm going to get the exact same thing. So change order. Numbers can change order. And that same thing is true for multiplication. 2 times 3 gives me 6, but so does 3 times 2. So it doesn't matter what order I multiply in for addition or for multiplication. Now, subtraction and division, that does matter. You can't just switch around the order for those 2. Commutative property. Now, I'm going to just keep giving definitions, so you may need to pause the video if you're not done writing before I move on. But your next property is called the associative property. The associative property. The associative property, one way that you can tell if you're talking about the associative property is if there are parentheses. It's not the only property that involves parentheses, but it is the only one where the parentheses are going to change. The important thing to remember is that the order does not change. If the order of the numbers is changing, then we're talking about the commutative property. So the only thing that changes in the associative property is where the parentheses are located. So for instance, if I had 2 plus 4 plus 3, and I had parentheses around the 2 and the 4, I could move those parentheses. Notice the 2, the 4, the 3, they're in the exact same place. But I'm going to move the parentheses to now be around the 4 and the 3 instead of around the 2 and the 4. Now let's make sure that's true. We know from GEMDAS that we have to do what's in the grouping symbols first. So in this first one, I'd have to do 2 plus 4, that's going to give me 6, and then 6 plus 3 gives me 9. When I move the parentheses over here, now I have to do 4 plus 3 first. 4 plus 3 gives me 7, and 2 plus 7 also gives me 9. So this property just shows that if you move those parentheses, it does not change your answer. But notice it was all addition. It can't have other operations in it. It also works if it's all multiplication. So I could have 2 times 4 in parentheses with a 3 outside. Remember, if the 3 is right next to the parentheses, that's multiplication. That's the same thing as if I kept the numbers in that order, but instead I put the parentheses around the 4 and the 3. So it's still 2, 4, 3, 2, 4, 3. The order has to stay the same. Okay, so let's prove it. So in the parentheses, 2 times 4 gives me 8, and 8 times 3 is 24. Over here, I have to do what's in the parentheses first. 4 times 3 is 12, and 2 times 12 is also 24. So again, if I keep the order the same and I move the parentheses, I'm still going to get the same answer. That's what the associative property tells me. The third property we're going to look at is called the identity property. Identity. When we're talking about ourselves, our identity is who we are, right? We have our identity. So that helps you remember this property. In the identity property, the number stays the same. In other words, it keeps its identity, right? You want to be true to who you are, right? And so does the number. It wants to keep its identity. So the number stays the same. There is something you can add to any number to make it stay the same, and that is 0. And I'm going to kind of make the 0 stand out here. So if I add 0 to 4, or any number, it just stays the same, right? It kept its identity. So that's the identity property, that you can add 0 to any number and it's going to stay the same. There's also a different number that you can multiply something by to make it stay the same. So 4 times 1, and again, I'm going to make the 1 stand out, equals 4. 4, again, kept its identity. So the identity property also says that you can multiply any number times 1, and that number is not going to change. Okay, the fourth property we're going to talk about, this one we sometimes get confused with identity because it also starts with I. But just remember, identity is who you are, and the number is going to keep its identity. Inverse has to do with two different things, one for adding and one for multiplying. So for adding, it's that if you add the opposite, so adding the opposite equals 0. And a lot of you already know this. We've done a lot of problems like this. So 5 and -5, those are opposites. So if you add two opposites together, they would all be 0 pairs. And so 5 plus -5 equals 0. But there's a different one for multiplying. So for multiplying, it has to do with reciprocals. And hopefully you remember what the word reciprocal means, but I will remind you if you don't. Multiplying by the reciprocal, and I actually showed y'all this when we learned about reciprocals, gives you 1. And if you've forgotten what reciprocal means, that's when we do the flip part of keep, change, flip. So when you flip a fraction upside down, you get its reciprocal. So for instance, if I had the number 5, that would be the same thing as 5 over 1. So the reciprocal would be 1 over 5. So I flipped it. So when you multiply by the reciprocal, that gives you 5 over 5, which is just 1 whole, right? So adding the opposite gives you 0. Multiplying by the reciprocal gives you 1. You're probably happy to hear that we are on our last one now. This is called the distributive property. Distributive. Some people have started seeing this on Dreambox. Notice that this has one big box. It doesn't have a separate one for adding and multiplying. So this is one way that you'll be able to pick this out on your assignment. This is the only property that has addition and multiplication together. All the other ones work for either one separately, not together. Okay, and what we do with the distributive property is we multiply the outside number by everything that's inside. And when I say inside and outside, I'm talking about inside the parentheses. So this one's also going to involve parentheses. So that could be a little bit tricky because associative also has parentheses. So when you see parentheses, you know you can narrow down to one of those, but you don't exactly know which one. So I'll give you an example with just numbers first. We're used to doing what's in the parentheses first, and that you can do that. But what the distributive property says is that you could also distribute this multiplication. You could do 3 times the first thing, so 3 times 2. And then you could do 3 times the second thing, 3 times 4, and then you could add them together, and it would be the same thing. The way you're going to be seeing this mostly, though, is with an algebraic example. Hopefully you remember that word from Friday. So in this example, we would do 6 times n, which just gives us 6n. And then we would do 6 times 2, which gives you 12. And then that plus sign stays the same. So you would get 6n plus 12. We can't combine those because one has a variable and one doesn't. And so that would just be your answer. Okay, so I know that might seem a little bit confusing to you, but I promise that if you use your examples, you'll do just fine on your assignment. So basically, it gives you an example, and then it gives you commutative, associative, identity, distributive. Each one of these represents an example of one of these properties, so you're just going to drag it to the appropriate one. If you think this is commutative, you'd put it there. If you think that's commutative, you'd put it there. If you think this is commutative, and so on. So again, you're just going to want to look back at your notes and go, okay, if it's something about adding the opposite equals 0, then I would know that it's inverse. If it's something about moving the parentheses around, I would know that it's associative, and so on. There are 2 slides, so make sure you do the first slide and the second slide. Then go ahead and turn it in, work on anything you're missing for me, or work on your Dreambox lessons. You do only 7 lessons this week, so fresh start. Let's get those lessons done, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye.